Welcome to our third lecture of the Luis Martín lecture series in the Humanities. We've titled it Discovering al-Andalus, the Art, Architecture, and Cultural Legacy of Islamic Spain. We are well underway in our exploration of this region and time period, and I want to thank you all this morning for coming and fighting the rain and the cold to get here. I kind of study a lot of Islamic art, culture, and literature, and it's interesting how the environment informs us on our perspectives of how we think about natural phenomena. So a lot of Arabic culture and a lot of Islamic culture rose in places that had limited rainfall. So whenever it rains in sort of an Arabic literary tradition, it's always considered merciful and good, and so I kind of look with good eyes upon rainy weather. So we'll take that as a good day today. Before beginning today's lecture, I want to address some of the questions I received after last week's lecture regarding available literature to read side by side to help everyone internalize a bit of the history and dates and times we've been discussing. I realize we've packed a lot of information into these hour-long lectures, and I'm equally confident that with some extra reading from these external sources, much of what we discuss here can be solidified in your understanding and perception. The first book on the left is titled Al-Andalus, the Art of Islamic Spain. I also brought it for show and tell, so you're welcome to come and see it afterwards. It was edited by an eminent professor in the field, Geraldine Dodds, and she included a series of essays by prominent scholars in the field of Islamic art and architecture on the visual culture of Islamic Spain. This book was published accompanying an exhibition on the Islamic art of Spain that was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in 1992. And since in recent years, the Met is increasingly trying to become open source, so the entire publication is available online for download. You just have to go to the Met website and you can Google the title and you can download the entire book for free if you're used to reading on a tablet or a computer. If you're like an oldie like me and you need a physical book like I do, then you will be able to find used copies of the book because I believe it is now out of print. But you can find different used copies on book selling websites like Amazon or ABE Books. This catalog has a spectacular selection of individual pieces of art with their descriptions belonging to the same time period which we've been discussing in these lectures. The second book recommendation I'd like to make is in the middle. This is a fairly recent book published in 2018. I also brought this for show and tell. It is a new publication by Professor Brian Catlos titled Kingdom of Faith, A New History of Islamic Spain. Professor Catlos goes through the history of Islamic Spain from the conquests, which we discussed last week, all the way to the expulsion of the Muslim population of al-Andalus in 1492, and he continues his narrative all the way to the 17th century. For those of you who have gotten into the habit of playing audiobooks in the car or at the gym, who needs Beyonce? There's also a downloadable version, audio version of this title available on websites like Amazon and audible.com. We'll show all those gym rats what we're made of. And lastly, there is a book that many of us might be familiar with, and that is titled Ornament of the World, How Jews, Muslims, and Christians Created a Culture of Tolerance in Medieval Spain. This is an older publication by Maria Rosa Menencal, a professor at Yale, who has now passed away, but she discusses a concept called convivencia, the idea that the three Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were able to live harmoniously in medieval Spain and create a unique and shared Andalusi or Spanish Andalusi culture and way of life. I hope to address the merits for and arguments against this perspective in a future lecture, But I believe understanding Menacal's perspective is important because the idea of convivencia largely shapes the way many scholars look at the history of medieval Spain during Islamic rule. And I do believe that third book is available in the Meadows bookstore. Last week, we discussed in detail how Visigothic Spain became al-Andalus, a new Muslim frontier, and as a result of Muslim military expansion beginning in the Middle East after the death of the Prophet and extending to North Africa and finally across the Straits of Gibraltar in Spain. As we learned, the conquest of Spain began in 711, and within a few years, the entire Iberian Peninsula came under Islamic rule. Today, I'd like to focus on A Tale of Two Cities as a subtitle for our lectures. And today we're mainly going to discuss Cordoba, and if we have any time left, we will begin our discussion of Medina to Zahra. These are two very important cities in the history of early Islamic Spain, and both were developed and brought to an apogee under the Umayyad rulers of Spain. And when we look back last week, we realized that it was a long path from the 7th century all the way to 711 to conquer the entire Iberian Peninsula. But instead of understanding the impact of the conquest on the Iberian Peninsula from modern maps, I thought it would be more beneficial to try to visualize it by using maps made in the medieval Islamic world itself. The rectangular map of the world behind me dates to the mid-11th century. It is rare and one of the earliest rectangular world maps from the medieval period that we know of. Usually, world maps from this period are circular. And as a footnote, I think it is also important to point out here that contrary to popular myth, medieval Muslims and other medieval cultures that had inherited a significant literary heritage of scientific knowledge coming from the ancient world knew that the world was round. There were not really that many flat earthers out there in the Middle Ages. They're very popular now. Medieval Muslims believed that all land masses, however, were encircled by an all-encompassing ocean. So when you see the circular maps representing the world at that time, you'll see the known world, which is only stretching all the way to the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. Of course, America wasn't discovered yet. And then the central area will be covered by an all-encompassing sea known as the al-Bahr al-Muhit, which means the encompassing ocean. This rectangular map, however, represents the known world at the time that it was made, around circa 1050. And we can see here that it is the world from the with two oceans on the side, the Pacific and the Atlantic. It comes from a manuscript called the Book of Curiosities, which was compiled in Egypt around 1050 of the Common Era. The manuscript that we have today that survives is a late 13th to early 14th century copy of the original text, which is now lost. This copy was purchased by the Bodleian Library at Oxford through an art dealer, and at around 2004 or 2006, I believe. And this is the first book of its kind that has a set of maps, several maps that are so rare that they changed our idea of medieval cartography and specifically medieval Islamic cartography. And of those sets of maps, I wish we could go through all of them, but today the one that we're going to go through is this rectangular world map. The artist who painted the map used specific colors to show bodies of water. So he's showing one color here. These are the oceans. These are the rivers. And he made several mountains in a reddish color and then a dark purple over here. And he labeled locations on the map. So all of these places are labeled. And I don't have my glasses on, so I don't see how clear it is. But you can see sort of the Arabic script marked with certain prominent locations on the map. One of the most recognizable features on this map is this large mountainous structure here at the top. It's colossal, and this mountainous structure actually tells us a lot about the history of medieval Islamic cartography. The mountain, as we've come to know it, is actually a legendary land feature known as the Mountain of the Moon, which in the ancient world, according to myth and according to the geography handed down to us by the 2nd century Greek geographer, mathematician, and astronomer, people were well accomplished at that time, named Ptolemy. He deems the Mountain of the Moon as being the mythical source of the Nile. So the water coming down from the mountain flows into various rivers into 3 sources and then feeds the Nile and then comes all the way down to Egypt. Now, I think what everybody's asking is then, we know the Nile River is in Africa and empties into the Mediterranean. So then why did the artist who rendered this map draw it upside down? This is an important observation. And have you ever asked yourself why north is featured as up on maps and south is featured as being down or at the bottom? The answer to that question is that we are all used to reading and seeing literature and bodies of academic knowledge that has been produced primarily from an early modern and modern perspective. And a lot of it was produced during a time when Europe had historically emerged as a leader in science, knowledge, and technology, so the 19th and 20th century. Our perspective, therefore, is largely Eurocentric. And as a result, today, most rectangular world maps will depict Europe in the center and at the north, at the top of the map, and with all the other countries on the side. Who gets to decide that? In the medieval Islamic world, as we see here, however, medieval Muslims didn't live with the notion of this Eurocentric perspective. They saw themselves as possessing political primacy, and as a result, maps were drawn with south at the top, so this says al-Junub, which is south, and north at the bottom. I thought I'd blow your minds at the beginning of today. Yes, thank you for reading my mind. And so, how does that? And so, I wanted to flip the map around to avoid our Eurocentric confusion that we have today. It's a visual perception that has been given to us, it's not our fault. And let's decipher this map more on how we would see it in comparison to a modern day map. So, as I said, this is the Mountain of the Moon, feeding into the Nile, leading up to the Mediterranean, past Egypt, Alexandria. And over here we have the Red Sea, which divides Africa from the Arabian Peninsula. This is the Arabian Peninsula, so this would be modern day Saudi Arabia. And while the artist of the map has drawn everything else, all the other cities and prime locations with just a red dot and a label, he chose to, or she, perhaps, we don't know who the artist was, or we don't know who the author of the book was either, decided to designate Mecca with this horseshoe type golden color arch. So he is, or she is, drawing prominent locations quite elaborately in his own mind. And over here, again, this is actually not a mountain, this is a walled structure, and it's the medieval city of Constantinople. And as far out as you got from the known world, then you would get fantastic sort of ideas that had found themselves into the myth of the medieval Islamic world. So I don't know if it's clear to you, but there is like a castle type structure over here. That is actually a wall that was in the medieval Islamic tradition. Alexander the Great has a prominent position, and so this is the wall of Gog and Magog. So the idea is that Gog and Magog were demons or monsters, and they had a monstrous army. So to keep them out from invading, Alexander the Great goes to what is Central Asia and creates a wall to keep Gog and Magog out. And so this legend is also in the Quran. the Muslim holy book, and it talks about how Gog and Magog continuously try to destroy this wall, and it finds itself pervaded throughout medieval Islamic and Arabic literature. Now, if this is Africa, this is Asia, this is India and China, which is kind of drawn together. This is a legendary island called Wak Wak. And the island got its name because in the legend, and as you see as we go towards the peripheries away from the center, we get more legends understood as realities in the medieval mindset. So the island of Wak Wak, which could be Australia or Indonesia, but it's off the coast of Asia, had a specific tree called the Wak Wak tree. And so the idea of this tree is that you would go to the tree, and the tree, when you saw it, actually had hanging bodies of women on it. And these women were beautiful maidens. But what happened in the fall, like in weather like this, is that those structures or fruits that were hanging from the tree in the shape of humans would fall down, and when they would fall down, they would lie to the ground and shrivel away, and in agony would yell, "Wak, wak," and therefore this became the legendary island of Wak Wak. I do not know what the origins of that story would be, or why people would fantasize falling women from a tree, but it finds itself in a lot of geographical texts in the medieval period. And this entire continent, if this is Africa, this is the continent of Europe. And this area is Spain. Now, let us take a closer look at Spain then. Spain, when we take a closer look at Europe on this medieval map, we see that al-Andalus, or Spain, is actually taking up most of the continent. The depiction of spatial location on the map should be noted here. Since most of Europe was not Islamocentric, let's put that word out there in the medieval period, we see that more space is allocated to al-Andalus on this map, and we also see a series of red dots. And these are the cities that are in this series of red dots. And they're labeled going from south to north across the Iberian Peninsula. This detail right here of these red dots helps us understand how many medieval Muslims geographically saw the world in which they lived in. As we discussed in the last lecture, as a result of the conquest, medieval Muslims had inherited much of the geographic area of what was the ancient Roman world. And part of this inheritance meant that they had taken in their possession several Roman institutions and systems which had survived the Vandal onslaught. One such system was the postal system, which the medieval Muslims called the Barid. The worldwide Roman road system allowed the entire Roman world or Roman Empire to be connected, and therefore Roman emperors could be sitting in Rome and send a message all the way across using the Roman road system and their postal system to send one message from one post to another. So if they needed to send an official message, they could send it all the way to Britain, all the way to Spain, all the way to North Africa, using the established postal system that they had. Medieval Muslims inherited this, and they enhanced the system to create their own system, which they called the Barid, which I mentioned earlier. And as a result, it was a very sophisticated system, actually, for the Middle Ages. We have stories that if a student went out to get an education, let's say that he grew up in North Africa, and he went to Baghdad, which was a center of learning, Baghdad, a center of learning, and he went there and he needed provisions, and it ended up being more expensive than it should have been. His parents living in North Africa could deposit money in the postal office, local, the Barid, and a check would be deposited there, and then it could go across from route to route, from station to station, until it finally reached Baghdad, and then they could get money from there. But obviously this is the medieval period, so it took several months probably for this process to happen. So there are also other stories that say that, oh, when students were really in destitution and desperate, there's a story of one student cutting off the sleeves of his of the clothes that he was wearing because textiles had a monetary value in the medieval Islamic economy. So he cut off his sleeves and then sold those in the market so he could get enough food to survive the week or the month until his check came. Sounds a lot like the horrors of graduate school for some people. Anyways, so the red dots on this map, what they indicate is the itinerary between 2 points. So I just slowly, I chose some of the random points to let you know, instead of making it too crowded, of what this itinerary looked like and what medieval Spain looked like to Muslims in the Middle Ages. This map, here's Malaga in the south, and this itinerary starts at Bajaya, which translates as Pequina. Here's Cordoba, here's Seville, and then goes all the way up, passing Badajoz, and then ending at Meknaza. And then you see in the north, past the mountains, there's even itineraries in the Christian north, because this part of al-Andalus remained Christian territory during the period that we're talking about, the 8th and the 9th century and the 10th century. And so here's Galicia, which is labeled, and then here's Leon, and then even under Leon it says, in which resides the king of the Galicians. So this is how they understood medieval Spain, that the large amount of it occupied what is most of Europe, because that was the known world to them, and then the other parts weren't that important. So when we critique Eurocentricity, we got to critique it. It's always the world power that creates sort of the centricity of the age. And so this concept of the dots basically was identifying a route, a travel route from one place to another. And the system that evolves in medieval Islamic geography is this idea of routes and realms. So what are the various ways that you can get from point A to point B, and where, in which realm are these points located? And this does not represent any accurate geographical pinpointing on a map, as we know, but how to explain it, I think the best way possible is that I did my PhD at Harvard, which is in Cambridge. I don't know how many of you have visited Boston, but Cambridge is kind of like the snooty academic part of Boston. So you cross the river, and once you cross the river from Boston to Cambridge, you're in Cambridge now. So when I was in Texas, I would be like, oh yeah, Harvard is in Boston. And when I moved there, I realized that no, you have to say that Harvard is in Cambridge. So when you use the subway system there, Cambridge falls on the red line of the T. That's another Boston name that you have to learn when you go there. You don't call it the subway, you have to call it the T. But this subway system, when you are on the red line, when you cross the river from Boston, you enter into Kendall Square, which is a point on a map in the on the wall of the subway. Then you go to Central Square, and then you go to Harvard Square, and then so on, so on. So this itinerary basically functions in the same capacity as a subway map. And this is how they were understanding location and space in the medieval period. This little introduction started from a question, so thank you very much. I do invite you all to ask questions. I tend to talk a lot, and I didn't start my timer this time, so. Please feel free to ask me any questions. Feel free to email me afterwards, and I will. I know that we're going through a lot of history, so I will continue to try to fuel part of the lectures with your questions. Now, the fact that this world was connected and individuals could travel long distances proved very fortuitous for the Umayyads of Damascus, the dynasty that we discussed last week in our lectures. Just to reiterate that history, Islam was started by the Prophet Muhammad, who was born in 571. In the year 610, he began to spread the religion of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula for 22 years. The original 12 years was in the city of Mecca, and then he emigrated to a new city in Medina in 622, where he continued his mission to spread the faith of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula and unite the tribes until his death in 632. He was succeeded by 4 rightly guided caliphs who were considered by early Muslims as companions of the Prophet to lead the Islamic world. During their reign, the Islamic conquest went beyond the Arabian Peninsula, as we learned last week. And in 661, a dynasty known as the Umayyads became the sovereign rulers of the Islamic world, and they ruled from Damascus. And so this was the dynasty that we had the prince, Walid II, who built the desert palace of Qusayr Amra in the middle of the Jordanian desert. Now, it is important to note that as a result of the Umayyad conquest, the Islamic world stretched from the borders of China and India to the east, all the way now to almost the entire Iberian Peninsula. Now, in 750, an important event occurred in Islamic history. The Umayyads were challenged by a rival dynasty, the Abbasids, who claimed legitimacy and the right to rule the Islamic world. They overthrew the Umayyads and persecuted them, removing them from their capital in Damascus. The Abbasid Empire was centered in Persia, what is modern-day Iraq. They would rule the Islamic world from their new capital city of Baghdad, which they founded in 762. But not before getting rid of every political rival which stood in their way, or who stood in their way. They were not able to permanently stretch their control to the Islamic West, and much of North Africa and Spain, as you see here in this map, remained disjointed from their control and their grip. And it was also because they spent a large portion of their early reign trying to gain control and gain power and a grip over the Islamic lands back in the Middle East. And to do this meant that they sought to obliterate each and every member of the Umayyad clan who might claim legitimacy to the throne. When they came to power in 750, the Abbasids hunted down the remaining Umayyads who had not been killed in battle and sought to assassinate them. Now, among these individuals, the last reigning Umayyads, was a young prince named Abdurrahman. Still a teenager at the time of the Abbasid revolution, he too was chased down by the Abbasids, and in one instance, it is reported that he barely escaped his assassins by jumping into the flowing waters of the Euphrates River and swimming across in safety in order to escape the soldiers pursuing him. So if we thought that coming here in the rain today was particularly difficult, let's just remember Abdurrahman, yes. Well, the Abbasids weren't exactly Shia either, but it sort of is fueled by the same ideology that the family of the Prophet was closer to the Prophet, was much more legitimate than the Umayyads. So the Umayyads were a cousin family that historically in the formation of the Islamic religion had remained enemies of the Prophet. But by the mid-7th century, they kind of all come in and then they actually seek power, and they were always centered in Syria and Damascus. Sorry, go ahead. They considered themselves more legitimate, but they were not the direct descendants of the Prophet either. They were actually, so Abbas, as I said, the idea is the Latin for the children of, so Abbas actually was the uncle of the Prophet and not direct descendants of the Prophet. So the Abbasids, in addition to pursuing the Umayyads, were also pursuing all the children of the Prophet's daughter Fatima with her husband Ali, who are called the Alids, or the children of Ali. So they were trying to seek complete control. And I left that part out because that opens a whole nother can of worms, but I hope it's clear now. And so among the Umayyads that he was pursuing, there was a young prince named Abdurrahman. Still a teenager at the time of the Abbasid revolution, he too was chased by the Abbasids, and as I said, he jumped into the Euphrates to escape these soldiers that were pursuing him. So if we thought it was difficult to get here in the rain today, let's think about what Abdurrahman had to do to get to Spain. When he momentarily reached a point of safety, the young prince gathered whoever was left from family members and loyal servants and clients to the Umayyads and decided to live a life in exile, traveling across the Islamic world towards the west. He first tried to go to North Africa, where he stayed for several years, but he wasn't welcome there because now he was an outlaw, and the current rulers of North Africa, who weren't directly under Abbasid control but still wanted to appease the Abbasid government in Baghdad, they were worried that his presence in the court would upheave their ability to maintain control in North Africa, excuse me. And so, because they saw Abdurrahman's presence among them as a threat to their own power, they basically said, "You're not welcome here." So Abdurrahman started looking northwards to Spain, because Abdurrahman's mother had been a Berber slave that was sent back to Damascus and wedded the caliph. Wedded the caliph's son, who was Abdurrahman's father. Abdurrahman's grandfather was actually the caliph. And she was a North African Berber, and her clan, or her tribe, had gone across the straits to Spain during the conquest. So that is the reason that Abdurrahman crosses the straits and goes to Spain to seek refuge amongst his clansmen, to seek sort of a loyalty of whatever final loyalties he had left. And so he crosses to Spain. When Abdurrahman entered al-Andalus in 755, he entered a disunited kingdom where Arabs, Berbers, and the surviving Visigothic lords who had surrendered to their new Muslim sovereigns were all squabbling amongst each other for power and control, since they all felt entitled to a piece of the land which was now called al-Andalus. Abdurrahman tried to take advantage of the political disarray by trying to win over the allegiances of the armies, the Arab armies that were there and had been present since the Umayyad conquest of 711. And up until this point, when he goes in 750, they had been allegiant to his family, the Umayyads in Damascus. So he tried to wield that loyalty and that power to try to unite the troops against the current rulers of al-Andalus, the current governors that were now allegiant to the Abbasids. Instead of joining forces with him, they actually decided to rebel against him. And as a result, Abdurrahman joined forces with the Berbers and the Yemen, the tribes of the soldiers that were from Yemen. These two factions join with Abdurrahman, and he starts to fight the army that's present in al-Andalus. And he fights his adversaries in battle in 756 right outside Cordoba, and he won. And as a result, he was named the commander and prince of al-Andalus and given the title ad-Dakhil. So whenever you become a ruler of the Islamic world, part of your legitimacy is to gain a title, which we'll talk about in next week's lecture with the rest of the Umayyads. But his title became ad-Dakhil, which means the one who entered. So he became known as the one who entered al-Andalus. And then the Abbasid Caliph back in Baghdad, al-Mansur, names him the Falcon, because he says that I tried so hard to assassinate this individual, and yet he went across the world and went out of my grips and was able to conquer al-Andalus. So he calls him the Falcon, a sucker in Arabic. Not the sucker. And thus, Abdurrahman I began to rule a small faction of al-Andalus from Cordoba. And for the next 26 years, he continued to fight and amass an army until he conquered al-Andalus for the Umayyads, thus establishing a new Umayyad dynasty in Spain. And at that time, the age of conquest, the Islamic conquests had settled. And so Abdurrahman's position now was not to advance territory for Islam, but rather to consolidate power and organize the political disarray that had plagued al-Andalus up until his arrival. He created a bureaucracy, a functioning government, taxation system, and under his rule, he began to create a visual Islamization of al-Andalus by building infrastructure and public buildings such as mosques. He also ensured that Cordoba become the new royal capital of the Umayyads. The early Muslim conquerors had chosen Cordoba to be the new capital after shifting from Toledo, which had been the Visigothic capital, and Seville, another important city. And Cordoba had a rich past. It was a Roman city that was on the banks of the Guadalquivir. And in antiquity, it was a former Roman city named Corduba. And it was built a little bit before the first century of the Common Era, before the millennia, and then rebuilt in the first century CE, and then renamed Colonia Patricia. The city was majestic and rich from trade and activities, and it was conveniently located on the riverbank, which made it ideal for mercantile activities. As a result of its prosperity, Roman Cordoba had well-made homes, street, temples, and forums, and recent excavations have also uncovered a Roman theater, a gladiator arena with graves for fallen gladiators, and the remnant of a large circus for imperial races. And you can see this in the map of Cordoba. Today, most of this is not completely excavated, but they're trying to make it more available. There were remnants of an entire circus, a gladiator arena, a theater, temples, a forum, well-built houses, and then this area was the old city that was built before the millennium. And then when they rebuild the city, they extend a suburb called Colonia Patricia, which extends all the way to the Guadalquivir, and it was a walled city, and then there was a Roman bridge going across the river into a main gate into the city. And this main gate entered into the main access, or the central main street of the Roman city, which went from the new suburb all the way to the old suburb, to the gate, to the old gate. The reconstruction map here, divides the city into two parts, as I said, and it was in this newer district right here that Abdurrahman chose to build his new mosque, a souk, or a large central market. And as a result of Abdurrahman's investment or infrastructure into the city, the population began to grow. And new suburbs shortly after started being built outside of the city walls. Abdurrahman also converted the Visigothic castle of Cordoba into the new palace for the Umayyad dynasty, known as the Alcazar today, or Alcazar comes from an Arabic word, al-Qasr, which means the palace. And the original Umayyad and Visigothic structures were rebuilt in 1328 when Alfonso XI of Castile began construction of the palace in the form we see it today. So this is the Alcázar de los Reyes Cristianos, built in 1328. It's a beautiful structure, and it is the original Visigothic and Islamic structures do not remain, and what we see on top is the construction that was begun by Alfonso in the 14th century. Outside of Cordoba, Abdurrahman built other structures. So he is known to have built a private palace villa surrounded by lush gardens with all types of plants coming in from the Eastern Islamic world. He named his suburban palace Ar-Rusafa, which was the name of the place of his childhood back in Syria before he was exiled. Among the plants that grew at Rusafa, it is reported that his sister back in Syria, she somehow survived the onslaught, sent him pomegranate seeds, which he grew a pomegranate tree in the gardens of his suburban palace. And he also had one single palm tree that was known to be located on the grounds of this palace, a date palm. And when he saw it, he's known for these verses. He wrote a verse about the date palm, and he says, quote, "A palm tree stands in the middle of Rusafa, born in the west, far from the land of palms. I said to it, how like me you are, far away and in exile, in long separation from family and friends. You have sprung from the soil in which you are a stranger, and I, like you, am far from home. May dawn's clouds water you, streaming from the heavens in a grateful downpour." So very much he was hoping for a day like today. And when we see the old city of Colonia Patricia, we see the main road. So this is the bridge crossing the Guadalquivir. The mosque was actually built, and it's on the closer to the walls, and across the mosque was the Alcazar. And this is a building the mosque near the imperial palace was something that was common in this early period, that the ruler residence or the imperial residence would be as close to the mosque as possible. So mosque and palace were often seen as one entity. And the Muslims took full advantage of previous Roman constructions throughout al-Andalus, and one of them is, can be seen here. For those of you who have gone to Cordoba, will remember that there is a bridge that enters the main city. This bridge was actually a Roman bridge rebuilt by the Muslims, and so the foundations today, we can see the Muslim foundations, but this bridge existed in the Roman period. And the Muslims repaired this bridge and continued to utilize it. This is another view. And Abdurrahman built his mosque near the banks of the river in what was the outer edge of the Roman suburb of Colonia Patricia. And all mosques are supposed to be oriented towards Mecca. So when someone prays in a mosque, the idea is that they're praying to Mecca, to the Kaaba, which is understood as God's house, and they are delivering and facing God in prayer. So therefore, all mosques are supposed to be set at a certain degree to face Mecca. But the Great Mosque of Cordoba is off by several degrees. Some scholars have suggested medieval calculations for this discrepancy, while others have suggested that the reason was that the mosque was actually built to accommodate the existing Roman urban plan, the grid system, and so the main axis of the city is aligned with the face of the mosque. And so instead of trying to find an accurate measurement, which they do later in other mosques, this one is a little bit off because, and many people have offered several reasons. And this is a better map to show you the location of how close it is to this, and then the main access. This mosque was extended, so when Abdurrahman builds his mosque, it's on the main axis of the road, and then these roads obviously change over time during the Islamic period. Now, and I know that we're almost midway, so I'll play some music that came along with this video that I took off of YouTube. The original mosque, built by Abdurrahman the first, began construction in 786, 2 years before he died. It wasn't a very large mosque, and it measured 50 by 80 yards. The prayer hall of the mosque, which we can see being built, was divided into 11 aisles, which were all separated by double arches, which were distinctly designed with alternating red and white voussoir stone masonry, which we will return to momentarily. The prayer hall was covered with a roof and had 11 portals leading into it. The entire mosque was enclosed by a wall, and between the prayer hall and the main entrance was a courtyard. And Abdurrahman did not build this tower. It was built later by his successors in the original mosque, and that tower was then destroyed, and then a new tower was built later by one of his successors. The courtyard in mosque, so this is the courtyard, you would enter from here. This would be the prayer hall, and then all mosques are equipped with a niche in the front, which whoever is leading the prayers will stand in front of that niche and lead the community in prayers. And so this, according to Islamic law, this direction is supposed to be facing Mecca. But the courtyard in mosque served as the first public place for congregation of Muslims in the new capital, a symbol of Abdurrahman's attempts to bring about a new administrative and bureaucratic capital from Cordoba. It also ended up being the cultural locus for the new Andalusian Muslim society. And Abdurrahman's mosque reflected a codified typology and form of early mosque construction present throughout the Islamic world at that time. And no need to look further than their origins. This is the Great Mosque of Damascus, which was built in 706 to 715. And you can see again that it's a walled structure with a tower right by where the main entrance would be, a courtyard, and then this would be the prayer hall. And the prayer hall, like the mosque before, would be facing Mecca, and there would be a prayer niche at the end for whoever was leading prayers. And this is another axonometric view. So as Abdurrahman's poetry verses of the date palm at his palace in Rusafa suggests, Abdurrahman had a nostalgia and longing for his home back in Syria. The construction of his mosque in Cordoba clearly reflects one of the earliest mosques in Islam, the Great Umayyad Mosque of Damascus, built between 706 to 715 on the site of a Christian monastery. And in this axonometric view, we can see clearly the courtyard and the tower and the prayer hall as three main components of early mosque construction. Yes?
You said the tower came later in the tower used for the call to prayer later as well, or is it for some other purpose?
So the early construction, what we know so far from the archaeology is that it wasn't really a minaret, but it was a version of a minaret, which was more called a soma, which was like a square sort of elevated position that would be used for the call to prayer. So someone would literally climb up this sort of bastion and give the call to prayer. And then eventually that evolves into tower structures, especially in North Africa and Spain. They become very high towers. And yes, typically they would be used by the muezzin, or the person giving the call to prayer, to sound the times. There's a lot of question that if I was on the top of the Meadows Museum and was yelling my head off, would you be able to hear me? There's now a lot of acoustic archaeology going on to understand how in different environments where there's not that many high structures, in combination with the weather, how far will a voice carry at those times? So these are all questions up to debate still. It was the interior of Abdurrahman's mosque in Cordoba which gave way to a unique Andalusian Hispano-Umayyad character of architecture. As we saw earlier in Cordoba's past Roman history, the city had several existing Roman and Visigothic structures which could supply the early Muslims with construction materials. The most visible of these materials to date are the pillars and capitals Abdurrahman used to create the hypostyle mosque. As you can see here, pillars of all types. So these are marble pillars, probably taken from other Roman buildings and other Byzantine buildings of the time. They're all different colors, so there's red and there's black, and there's no discernible systematic pattern of putting them in there. But he took 110 pillars for his early mosque, and then along with that, he took several different capitals from different places. And the capitals of these 110 different pillars and capitals are all different throughout the mosque. So there is no, it's not like they were looking from one building particularly and saying that, okay, we're going to make them all match. They were smart in their construction, that instead of reinventing the wheel, let's reuse. So maybe we could say they were a little green, or just smart in construction. And so they understood the artistic value of these pillars and capitals and placed them in the mosque. Now, as we said, the most prominent and recognizable feature of Hispano-Umayyad architecture is the horseshoe arch. So it's this arch shape that's sort of in the shape of a horseshoe. And then additionally, another feature is this alternating voussoir of red and white stone. And this becomes, starting with Abdurrahman, his successors stay true to this style, and it is carried over in the next city that we'll talk about next week, Madinatul Zahra. And so this red and white alternating stone, voussoirs, they interlock in place, and the arch is formed, and it's all cut stone, become the paragon of Andalusi architecture. Now, where was Abdurrahman getting these ideas? The horseshoe shape of the arch in the interior of the Great Mosque of Cordoba was an architectural feature which was common to Spain when the Muslims arrived. There's a lot of scholarship trying to say that no, the horseshoe arch was present in Syria and therefore they were bringing a Syrian form of architecture, but I don't think we need to look that far. Visigothic architecture commonly used the horseshoe arch in many of their constructions. This is the Cathedral of Palencia in Spain. It was originally built in the 12th century, and we're talking much more earlier than that, so this 12th century structure is not that important to us. But what is important is the crypt of San Antolin, which is under the cathedral. It was built in the 8th century, right before the Muslim invasion, and it still exists. And what you can see in the crypt, which is Visigothic, built in the 7th and 8th century, is the horseshoe arch with the stone masonry and with decorative carved capitals, which are not as elaborate as the Roman ones, but also these types of capitals were reused in Islamic buildings as well. And if we take another example, this is Santa Maria de Malc, built in the 7th and 8th century, and the interior of the church consists of a central aisle with an apse flanked by 2 aisles, and then you can see clearly the horseshoe-shaped arch, and in the central aisle, and the church is in the shape of a cross, but here in the apse, this arch right here can be clearly seen with the horseshoe arch shape here. And another Visigothic church, if you remember the crown from last week by Reckonswith, this church was built by him in the 7th century. And again, this is what many scholars say is most likely one of the locations that really echo the architecture of the Great Mosque of Cordoba. You can see a series of horseshoe arches in the interior of the mosque with blind niches at the top. Now, it has also been suggested, now the other thing about those arches that we saw, if we look back, is that, okay, so we say that the horseshoe arch was from there, but then this is the first example in Islamic architecture of a double arch. Now, was he just trying to make the ceiling higher, or was this an artistic feature? Nonetheless, we do not see a set of 2 arches, one on top of each other this early in Islamic architecture. So again, we can look back at the Levant near Syria, in Lebanon, to a Umayyad city built called Anjar, built in circa 714. And in this city, which was a palatial city built by the great-grandfather of Abdurrahman in 714, it has 2 distinctive features: alternating red and white stone used, and then the double arching. But again, Spain and previous Roman architecture seems to be more likely plausible as a source of inspiration for Abdurrahman during his construction and planning. To the north of Cordoba, above Madrid, is the city of Segovia. And here, portions of a 2nd century aqueduct still remain standing, and this construction, as we can see, has a double arch. So this was most likely the construction technique that they were looking for as a reinforcement of an arch above an arch to create this massive ceiling for this mosque. And then to the west of Cordoba, we have another aqueduct in an area called Mérida. It's a Roman aqueduct built in the 1st century, and it was renovated in 300 AD or CE. And what is interesting about this aqueduct is that it employs a Roman technique of building called the opus mixtum, which means that it's a combination of stone and brick, therefore alluding to the red and cream-colored voussoirs that we see in Abdurrahman's first architecture, which then become part of the Spanish Andalusi tradition of making arches. And so perhaps this seems, as scholars often look at this aqueduct as the source for this type of artistic and architectural style. The exterior of the mosque was just as elaborate as the interior. You can see all types of, you can see the arches repeating horseshoe with the same design reflecting the inside. And then there's all types of vegetal motifs carved into the stucco walls outside of these blind niches, and then various geometric patterns. Some of them have survived, some of them haven't. And elaborate entryways all throughout the walls of the mosque. And the mosque itself, the walls were very much like a fortification with crenellations at the top, reflecting sort of a military architecture. And here's a close-up. And in addition, and we'll hopefully get to inscriptions next time, but many of these inscriptions reflect the ideologies of, because when you put a message in the inside and the outside, your message are to the people viewing it. So for the outside, largely the message is directed to the Christians and the Jewish people living in Cordoba about the oneness of God, and so certain passages from the Quran are selected to reflect those, while in the inside, other messages are chosen deliberately in the architectural scheme. And so what Abdurrahman does is he creates a visual vocabulary for Spain. He creates the roots of the Umayyad dynasty of Spain, which lasted from 756, from when he wins the battle outside of Cordoba against the Arab armies, and until 1031. And this is a reign of successors that rule after him. So Abdurrahman I, and then his son is Hisham I, and then one after the other. Then they were very creative, and so there's Abdurrahman I, there's Abdurrahman II, and then there's Abdurrahman III, we are going to be talking about in detail next week. And what Abdurrahman III does is that he creates a culture for, he actually is the first Umayyad ruler. So at the beginning, when Abdurrahman wins, he's crowned Amir of Spain. They do not call him the Caliph. But all the way in 912, so later on in his reign, Abdurrahman III actually claims that no, he is now the Caliph of the Islamic world. So they had, this was the apogee of Umayyad power in Spain, this period right here. I'll wake you guys up a little bit as we end. The Great Mosque of Cordoba was extended throughout different reigns. The first extension we can see is that it kept on growing onwards because as the population grew, so did the need for more space in the mosque. So the mosque kept on getting extended further out. The courtyard gets bigger. As we see, the minaret or the original tower is no longer present. And then during the reign, so this is after Abdurrahman III, Al-Hakam II creates more and more elaborate portions of this mosque. So he expands it in length and in width. So then the original mihrab or the original prayer niche was then replaced with a new section exclusive for the royal family. And I will just end with what Al-Hakam II's renovations were. One of the major renovations was the great mihrab. This is the prayer niche, and this is the first prayer niche of its time that actually was almost like the size of an entire room where someone would, where the leader would pray for the rest of the community. He invites mosaicists from the Byzantine world because now the whole world is connected, so he brings the best of the best to Cordoba to create the most beautiful, elaborate mosaic patterns on this, what we call the Qibla wall. The Qibla is the wall that is facing Mecca. In addition, this area becomes reserved only for royalty in the mosque. And so he creates a series of polylobed arches, which are not following the red and white alternate stone, but there's elaborate carvings between each of these. And they're still double arched, but then the bottom one is polylobed. He creates a special door for the mosque, so the caliph doesn't have to come in from the general public, but he actually comes in from the wall of the Qibla and can go directly into the prayer niche. So the caliph never had to be seen. So he was present and not present at the same time. A great way to create legitimacy. And he puts new epigraphy in the mosque. And what is interesting about this is that the epigraphy, as I said, reflects the ideologies and the political ideologies that the Umayyads are trying to create of their self-image. And as a result, these floral designs that you see are actually breaks between two different verses from the Quran. But in al-Hakam's coins, we actually see similar patterns coming in on his coins, which I think is a wonderful observation made by the scholar that wrote about this. And this is probably the most elaborate addition to the mosque. So medieval Islamic mosques around the prayer niche had a dome on the top, which was known as the Maqsura, which was the area reserved for the caliph and his family, and was often blocked off from the rest of the public. And we know in al-Hakam's time, they created a special door for him to enter and exit without being seen, which was covered, and it was a direct entryway directly from his palace. So he could leave the palace and enter the mosque without ever being seen by the public. And a lot of these measures were taken for safety as well, because as they became more powerful, they garnered more enemies. This is inside the prayer niche, this is a seashell design that is the top of the niche. And this is the dome, the Maqsura that we see right in front of the mihrab, so the dome right in front of the prayer niche. And you can see that it is a rib dome, which is a construction that they take from North Africa, but what they do is that they continue the mosaic patterns and the use of brilliant tesserae to fill this entire space in making it such a beautiful and wonderful construction. And lastly, around the prayer niche, he includes epigraphy, and passages from the Quran, and also because now Hakam is now a caliph at this point in time. So his entire name is written on the prayer niche, and what it echoes is manuscripts from the time. So this is a very famous Quran. It was done entirely in vellum and dyed blue. And it's called the Blue Quran. It dates to the 9th century more likely. It's what the artist would do, or the calligrapher would scrape the entire piece of vellum and then illuminate it with gold. And so this entire Quran is basically blue vellum with gold writing all over it. And it clearly resembles the artwork that is going around the prayer, the mihrab in the Great Mosque. And so we'll end here today with the Great Mosque, and hopefully next week we'll talk about a palatial city, Madinat al-Zahra, that was built to the west of Cordoba during the Umayyad reign, and then also talk about the arts and the various technologies of textiles, agriculture, and ceramics that are all flooding into al-Andalus, because Andalus is now part of a largely connected world. So thank you again for coming out in the rain, and I hope to see you next week.